So, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I am Dennis Schultz, the president of the New York City Metro chapter of Blacks in Technology. If you're not familiar with Blacks in Technology, we are a national, soon to be international nonprofit who advocate for African Americans, Black people in technology, just like it sounds. So if you are not a member and you're interested in participating in events like this and other events, hopefully more physical social events once we get through COVID, please sign up, join our mailing list, become a member. We have a lot of fun and you will learn a lot. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Janice Gassam, who is a TED Talker, a Forbes contributor, and an author with a new book out, Dirty Diversity. Um, Janice, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thank you, Dennis, for the opportunity to chat with all of the Black and Techers. And excuse me, I'm so sorry if you see any blueberry in my teeth, because for those of you who just joined, I'm drinking a smoothie to keep my energy up. But I'm really excited to be here, and I think that this is definitely a relevant and timely conversation about why Black employees are leaving the tech industry. But I think that there's a lot of spillovers and crossovers into other industries. And some of these issues that we're going to talk about are expansive across all different fields and industries. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share this presentation. So again, you can call me Janice. But so why are Black employees leaving tech companies? This is a really important conversation, and I wrote an article on this topic asking the question because I thought it was really important to focus specifically on Black employees, because I think that a lot of times we look at employees of color as a whole, but I think there are some issues that are relevant and unique specifically to the Black community that are important to address. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about and focus on is terminology. This is a question that I get a lot. So a lot of the work that I do is workshops and training sessions for companies around creating environments that are more equitable and inclusive. So one thing that I started doing was actually called Ask Me Anything. So at the end of the racial equity workshops that I do, I send out an anonymous link for employees to ask any race-related questions, but particularly questions that pertain to the Black community. And I say, ask me anything. And this is by far probably one of the most popular questions that I get is, what do you prefer to be called? What is your preferred terminology? So I thought that to open up the conversation on why Black people are leaving the tech industry, and there's this mass exodus of Black employees, it's first important to make sure that we familiarize ourselves with the proper terminology. So I am only speaking for myself as one Black woman, but I prefer to use the term Black. And I think that when we're having this conversation, it's important to use the term Black because, again, there are issues that are unique to Black employees, and there are issues that Black employees face that deserve discussion and that deserve consideration. So I always just say, call me Black, because Black is an all-encompassing term that could mean a person who has been here in the US for generations. It could mean a person who's first generation American. It could be a person who is an immigrant, but Black is kind of like an all-encompassing term. So I wanted to ask y'all if any of you out there are people of the diaspora, what is the term that you prefer to be called? Do you prefer to be called a Black Indigenous person of color? Do you prefer to be called Black American minority ethnic? Do you prefer to, because I know that BAME is a term that's popular more in Europe. Do you prefer to be called African American? Do you want to be called Black? What is your preferred, and you can just write it in the chat box, but what is your preferred terminology? So I see Patricia said, I prefer Black. Dennis said all Black everything. Black, African, African American, Black American. black, black. I prefer black, black, all black, everything. I agree. I'm black, black, blackity, blackity, black. So and I think that there is a lot of like, I don't know if y'all notice this, but for me, people are like really scared to say black. And they're like, oh, if they're describing me, they'll say, oh, the young professor. And I'm like, you can call me black. I'm a black professor, the only one in the department. It's okay. So like, it's important to, when we're talking about this conversation, we're speaking specifically to black people. And I think that that's part of the problem is that, we don't want to conflate the issues that are faced by Asians or Asian Americans or that are faced by the Latinx community. We have very similar issues, but we want to speak specifically to, and I'm glad that with everything, all of the horrible things that have transpired in the last month, that tiny bit of good that can come out of this is that we are speaking directly to Black people in the Black community. Companies are chanting and shouting Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. So I'm really happy because I'm not a huge fan of the term African American. I'm not a huge fan of people of color. I think that it's important to have, when we have this discussion, to focus specifically on the Black community. So one of the issues when I was doing my research and when I wrote this article, I wrote an article last year called why your Black employees keep leaving. And in my research of writing this article, I found a study that was done by the Center for Talent and Innovation. And they looked specifically at Black people. And they looked at, why is there this mass exodus of Black employees? Why is it that, Black employees are very difficult to retain in a lot of different industries? And one of the reasons that they found was that this issue of, we tend to conflate the issues that Black people are experiencing, and we lump Black people in with people of color. And I think the danger in doing that is when we're looking at just white people and non-white people, you might look in your organization and say, wow, we have a lot of, and speaking in the tech industry in particular, the tech industry comes out with these diversity reports every year. Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple, all come out with these diversity reports. So they might say, oh, we have, this percentage of our employees are Black, and this percentage are Asian, this percentage are Latinx, but, only, let's say 50% of our employees are white. So it looks like we have a lot of diversity. But if you look specifically at and look at the breakdown, what you'll find is that there is a much higher representation of Asians in the tech industry and in a lot of different industries, and less representation from Native Americans, from the Latinx community, and from the Black community. So it's important when we analyze the data and when we're having these conversations to speak specifically about Black people and the issues that are faced by the Black community, because again, these are issues that are sometimes unique to other industries. So it's important not to shy away from conversations about race. And what I'm really happy about, again, in this dark moment, is that companies are opening up their doors and inviting employees and inviting outsiders like me to come and facilitate these conversations around race. Interesting story is that I do these workshops and these trainings, and I was having a discovery call with this company, and on the discovery call, they basically tell me what their diversity issues are, and then we discuss workshops and trainings that I can design that will focus on how to resolve their particular issue. So this company, I was talking to them and they said, we want you to come in and do this unconscious bias training, but we don't want you to talk about white privilege. And we don't want you to really talk about racism. And I was like, okay, so you want me to come in, have this discussion, but like tiptoe around these really, really important issues. And so part of the problem and the reason why we're in this space that we're in, and I say we as in like companies are in this place that they're in today, is because we haven't been having conversations about race. We haven't been having open and honest dialogue. And when we have the diversity, equity, and inclusion conversation, oftentimes that conversation excludes race. We're not talking about race, we're talking about gender equity. We're talking about the rights of the LGBTQIA plus community. We're talking about veteran representation. We're talking about ensuring that there is different generations in our workplace and they're being represented. But race is often like the very last peg that we focus on. And when we're talking about why is it that Black employees keep leaving, one of the things that many Black employees want to see is more conversations on race. We need to be talking about and having these conversations more. And I say that race is like the pink elephant in the room, and that's why I have a pink elephant up there. It's like, imagine you're in a room and a hot pink elephant walks in the room and you're pretending you don't see this hot pink elephant that's in the room. And that's what a lot of our companies have been trying to do when it comes to race, and pretending we don't see race, and adopting this viewpoint that we don't need to have conversations about race because our organization is colorblind. We don't see color. We don't, we weren't raised to see color. And the longer we hold on to these antiquated sort of mindsets, the longer this problem of racial inequities will persist. So one of the reasons why Black employees aren't staying at companies is that their companies are not having candid and open and honest dialogue about race. There's often a conflation with, like, when we're talking about the Black community, we as Black people get lumped into conversations about all people of color. And that's problematic because there are specific issues that are very unique to the Black community, such as when we're talking about microaggressions. Deloitte did a 2019 State of Inclusion survey where they found that racial microaggressions are experienced most by Black people. And I don't think that this is surprising to anybody, but Black people experience the highest incidences of racial microaggression. So if we're not really talking about race and we're just kind of talking about these issues and not leaving the surface level issues, we're not going to really get at the real underlying issues, and these issues of anti-Blackness and these issues of white supremacy, and how to create systems and structures that are equitable for everybody. So that's an important part of the conversation. And I see, Dennis, you said the tech industry on average is like 3% Black. Yeah, if you look at, and every year I read these, I just look at these diversity reports from 4 of those major companies of like Microsoft, Apple, Google, and I'm missing one, Facebook. And if you look specifically at their racial breakdown, the progress has been stagnant. So it's important to look specifically, and they just started in 2019 or 2020, they just started looking at this intersectionality piece where they're looking at, okay, we were just looking at women, but what is the racial breakdown of the women? How many of these women are Black or Latinx or Native American? And that's also important to look at because the representation is so low. I agree, Dennis. Companies lump Black employees into their diversity number, which includes women and other affinity groups. Yeah. So one thing that has been frustrating to me is that this conversation is always at the bottom of the list. And when I'm brought in to have these conversations about gender equity, they often don't include that intersectional lens where we're talking about, yeah, women get paid on average less than men, but what about Latinx women? What about Black women? What about Asian women? And that's usually not part of the conversation. So we can't shy away from having these conversations, and we have to be very specific when we're talking. I don't like, I'm not a huge fan of the term person of color. It's easy to use the all-encompassing term, but when we talk about, racial equity, we have to call it out for what it is and say Black. Who are we talking about? We're talking about Black people. We're talking about white people. We're talking about, so I think that that's a huge part of the issue. And I'm cautiously optimistic that after these next 3 months, when everyone's kind of starting to forget about all of this, past this great awakening, that companies are still going to be interested in having these conversations. I hope so. But that's part of the reason, is that like we're not having enough of these conversations about race. So encompassed in this open dialogue, we need to have more conversations about these 6 factors. Are we having conversations about microaggressions? How is your organization dealing with microaggressions, and racial microaggressions in particular? Because one of the main issues that when I speak with employees, when I speak with Black employees in particular, they share with me that they feel like they don't know how their company is addressing the microaggressions and the statements that are said that aren't illegal or aren't at the surface, they don't seem that bad, but it's like over time it's like death by a thousand cuts. So the Black women in the workplace asking questions like, can I touch your hair? And as a Black employee, as a junior Black employee, you may feel obligated to let your manager touch your hair because it's like, I want to get this promotion, but it's disgusting. I don't know what this person has been doing with their hands, and I don't know. So all of these like microaggressions, whether they're behaviors or their statements that are taking place. So companies that want to figure out and I guess understand the experiences of Black employees have to be having conversations on microaggressions. Privilege is a big one. People don't want to have conversations about privilege, and there's a lot of pushback when you come into a company and you start talking to a mostly white workforce, like a tech industry where there's this very bro culture, and you start talking about privilege, people tune out and their eyes roll back in their head, and or there's this defensiveness. I don't know if any of you watched, there's a documentary on Netflix that Chelsea Handler came out with called Me and My White Privilege, or Me and My Privilege. And I showed this documentary to my students in the fall when I taught diversity and inclusion. And in the documentary, Chelsea spoke with 3 or 4 white women from Orange County, California. And she was asking them, like, what are your thoughts on white privilege? How do you think it manifests? And these women said that they felt white privilege did not exist, and that people of color have privileges such as being able to get jobs and get into schools. And so I think that having the conversation about privilege is difficult for a lot of people because, like, these women are obviously misinformed. Like, anyone who's done any sort of reading and research about affirmative action, for example, knows that the main beneficiaries of affirmative action are white women. So there seems to be like just this, I would say like privilege, but particularly white privilege is one of the most challenging subjects for people to really grasp and understand. And particularly white people who feel like they did not come from an advantaged or wealthy background. I've had conversations where people say, I don't have privilege. My parents were poor, and I come from, and privilege doesn't mean that you didn't work hard to get to where you're at. But if we're not even like having these open and honest conversations about privilege, nothing is ever going to get resolved. And I think that that's a huge part of the problem. And even now when I have these discussions with people and I talk about ways that I have privilege, I am a Black woman, but I'm a lighter skinned Black woman. And I recognize that because I grew up in the suburbs and the way that I speak, if you don't see me, you think I'm a white woman. So once you see me, you're like, oh, I thought she was white. But the way that I speak, I recognize that I have privileges and all of that. And when I come into these companies and I have these conversations, they're like, oh my gosh, wow, I never realized that you as a Black woman could have privilege. So like, it's important to have these conversations, but also understanding how we approach these conversations, because in my experiences, people are, depending on how you frame it, could increase or decrease people's receptiveness to the message. So I see Kirsten said companies are quicker to discuss equality in sexual preference because that's uniform across all ethnicities. They use people of color because it's a scapegoat to be general in the oppression of all non-white people. But if you say Black people, you have to deal with some very specific racial problems. Anyone can have a sexual preference, but only Black people can be Black. Yeah, so Nikisha said I was about to mention affirmative action comments. Yeah, a lot of it is, and that's the problem with, one of the issues and the reasons why is like Black employees are leaving because you're not having these conversations about race, and there's a lot of misconceptions and people just thinking things like, oh, well, affirmative action means we're hiring an unqualified Black engineer to come and work in our company. No, that's not like, and I'm not saying that that doesn't happen, but that's not the purpose and the goal of affirmative action. Affirmative action, when implemented correctly, has shown to increase the representation of underrepresented groups, of Black people, of Latinx people. So like there's this misconception that, you know, Black people and different racial groups are getting jobs and don't have qualifications and all of this stuff. And there isn't an understanding of, so I think that when we talk about like how to have conversations about race, you cannot have a conversation about race without talking about privilege. There's just absolutely no way, because you have to correct the inequities that are within the workplace, and recognizing ways that you have privilege will allow you to correct some of those inequities, and recognizing maybe me as a white man, my voice is valued more in the boardroom, and my Black female colleague gets interrupted more than I do. So because of that, I'm going to make sure I amplify her voice so that if she's ever interrupted, I'm going to stop and say, wait, Janice was saying something. Let's go back to what Janice was saying. So like having also conversations about systemic racism is not a conversation that people want to have. So we have to move from talking about individual racism, which is definitely important. And I honestly think that the public discourse and conversation is focused on individual racism. If any of you have read the books that are back on the New York Times bestsellers list, like So You Want to Talk About Race, and How to Be an Anti-Racist, and White Fragility, and all these books, the focus is on the individual blind spots that you have, which is important. But it's important also for organizations to address these systemic issues, because if I'm a manager and I realize all of a sudden I have white privilege, if the structures and systems within the organization allow me to be biased in my hiring or be biased in the systems to promote employees, then me recognizing and coming to this awareness is not going to actually produce long-term or systemic changes. So there has to be that conversation of the individual racism and then the systemic. And then looking at stereotypes, and that ties back in with microaggressions and how you address microaggressions. Are you reporting? Anytime an employee reports microaggressions, what happens? Is there like a written report? Does it go to HR? I always recommend like companies having an anonymous helpline, because I think that that's really effective if you want to report your manager, but you can't because, you know, so looking at that. But also an important piece of the conversation that I don't think enough people are having is also this idea of white adjacency. So part of the reason why people are not a huge fan of the term a person of color, like me as a Black person, part of the reason is because I recognize, and we should all recognize, that you can be a person of color, but align yourself with whiteness for the perceived privileges and benefits that comes with. And you could be a person of color and still uphold or have anti-Black views. So I think that that's an important part of the conversation, because sometimes leaders point to the ethnic minorities in an organization and say, look, our CEO is Indian, or look, we have an Asian chief financial officer, so we can't be racist. And it's like, yes, you can, because you could still be a person of color and still uphold views or still have views that are anti-Black. So when we're having this open dialogue and figuring out like, why can't we keep Black employees? The white adjacency piece is a really important part of the conversation. And I think that it's not always highly discussed and heavily discussed, but we have to like include that conversation into this dialogue. So I think we've all seen a lot of performative allyship lately. And I think that part of the reason why Black employees leave is that companies, these are the company words and these are the company actions. And a lot of times they're not aligned. I'm sure y'all have had experiences with this. I have too, where companies say that they're about this and about that, but they're not, they're not showing it through their actions. I'll give you an example. This past February, a very well-known large consulting firm reached out to me and said, we want you to come and do a workshop on microaggressions. And I was like, okay, cool. And I was very excited because this is like one of the top consulting firms in the world. Everyone knows this company, right? So I was so excited. And so they asked, what is your speaker rate? I gave them my speaker rate and they were like, that's too much. We don't have the money for that. Can you come down on your rate? So I was like, and I never do this, but I was like, you know what? This is a really well-known company. I would love to, design this, whatever for them. So cool. I was like, yeah, that's fine. I'll take a lower rate. So 2 days before the workshop, they sent me a non-disclosure agreement. And in the NDA, it specifically said, I cannot tell anyone that they were my customer, they were my client. I can't take any pictures and this was before COVID. This was in February. So I can't take any pictures when I go there to do my speaking engagement. I can't use their logo or anything on my website. They had all of these different things that and the irony, I didn't miss the irony of this whole situation. You're asking me, a Black woman, to come in during Black History Month to talk about microaggressions when this whole situation is one big microaggression and you don't want to pay me what I'm worth. So what ended up happening is the night before the event, I explained to them that I wasn't comfortable with the NDA and I didn't feel comfortable signing it. And at 7 p.m., they were like, well, we can modify the NDA to basically say, you can take pictures, but we have to just approve it first. But everything else still stays. And I was like, you know what? I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm okay. I no longer want to participate in this speaking engagement, but that just goes to show you, like, this is a company that thinks that they're doing something by bringing a Black person in. Probably the only time that they've ever brought somebody in or they bring Black people in is during Black History Month, which is another problem. And then they don't even want to pay me. And this is $1 billion, this is like either a multi-million-dollar or $1 billion organization. They're making so much money and you can't afford to pay it's just, it's beyond me. So I look at a lot of companies and I'm just like, yeah, it's cute that you're posting Black Lives Matter, but there's no Black people in your organization or on your board. I don't want to see Black people only at lower levels in your organization. So if you feel like Black Lives Matter, I need to go into your website and see that there's Black faces throughout your website. Otherwise, I don't want to see. So part of the reason why Black people leave and why a lot of us don't feel comfortable at these companies is that their words are not aligned with their actions. I see Michael said you should have put them on blast. Yeah, I'm just not the type that puts companies on blast, but I think they're considered one of the big four of consulting companies. So I'm sure there's like only one of four that could be, but it's a very well-known, I think they used to be the #1 consulting firm. But they just, exactly, Dennis, they just wanted to check the box and say, look, we brought a Black person in during Black History Month, but we don't want to pay her what she's worth. And we have this NDA that we asked her to sign 2 days before the event. Dennis, yeah, it's one of those. Yeah, so yeah, it's one of those, Dennis. You guessed correct. But yeah, so I mean, we need to see actions and we need to see, actions need to line up with words. And ironically, Dennis and Michael, that company that you mentioned, that I'm not going to say their name, has been in the diversity list. So a lot of these websites put out like most diverse companies to work for. That company has been on the list multiple times. And I just am like, some of them may be paying to get on these lists. I don't know how they're getting on these lists, but we need to see actions lining up with words. So, part of the reason why a lot of us don't stay at these companies or don't want to stay at these companies is because their actions are not lined up with their words. I'm sure you all saw 2 years ago, that manager at Facebook, the Black male manager wrote this Facebook memo about the toxic culture for Black people at Facebook. And then last year in November, there was that anonymous Medium article where 12 or 13 Black employees who worked in Facebook spoke again about this very, very toxic culture. So we need to, and now is the time for companies to really be like, if I were an organizational leader, I would really be on it, because people are not afraid to put their companies on blast. People are not afraid. Like, social media makes it so easy now to just be like, boom, 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 like, this company's racist, don't support them. And it can have such a detrimental effect on the brand. So it's like, your actions need to definitely line up with your words. I see Patricia said, I spoke with him briefly. It's about being white adjacent. If your CEO is white, then you will have an issue. Yeah. Any white person who was raised in Western society has some ingrained white supremacist views that have to be dealt with. And even as a person of color, we can still uphold some of these views. And it's important, again, for us to recognize that, but we have to be having the conversation. And a lot of times, companies aren't allowing us to have the conversation. So I'm like taking every opportunity I can to have this conversation and talk about it. Like, where did your anti-Black views come from? And, these are conversations that even last year I was not able to have, but we're in a call out culture where companies have no choice but to try to make changes. So kind of going along with what I was saying, part of the reason why Black employees are leaving is you're not paying us our fair worth. You need to be paying us what we're worth. And we're not going to stand by and allow you to, I'm sure there are some people who would have been like, okay, consulting company, I will still speak, even though you're paying me 1/3 of my normal rate, and I can't even share that you were a client. But I think that a lot of us are standing up for ourselves now and saying, we're not going to accept this subpar treatment from companies. So if you are wondering, why are your Black employees leaving? Assess pay. Look at, are Black employees being paid the same as their counterparts? Are Black employees and Asians and whites being paid the same rates? And there was a tech company, and I'm forgetting the name, but they were embroiled in a lawsuit last year or the year before that. And I'm forgetting, it's like some sort of programming company, and the name is escaping me, but they were found to be, they underpaid Black and Asian female employees, I believe, millions and millions of dollars. So they were embroiled in lawsuits. I'm sure there's other tech companies also, but it's like, you have to pay us our fair worth. And if you don't, a lot of, the Black entrepreneurship rates are skyrocketing, and a lot of Black employees are leaving their organizations to start their own businesses. And we're saying, like, we don't have to stay at a company that's not going to pay us our worth, that's going to treat us like crap. And we could start our own company and thrive. So it's like making sure that you're paying us our fair share. Job seekers, so Dennis, you said job seekers who identified as Black unhired expected $129K salary on average, with eventual offers averaging $134. White job applicants sought $138 and $144 respectively. Well, yeah. So that's also part of the problem, is that, like, I think that we as Black people have, many of us have become accustomed to just accepting less than what we're worth. And so that's why we need more, more of us need to be like, we're not going to accept this, like, you bringing me in only during Black History Month. What are you doing for Black employees outside of Black History Month? Like, that's the question that we need to be asking these organizations more. But it's like also not standing by and allowing these companies to pay us less than what we're worth. Michael says, yep, that's why I stopped working for companies on Long Island. They like to lowball Black people. Michael said, Hired.com even released a report on tech salary last week saying Blacks are still paid the least. That's interesting. Thanks for sending that, Michael. Yeah, so but I'm glad we're in, people are ready to call out these companies. And I know a lot of us maybe in corporate America still, so we can't actively engage in the call out, or we have to put up, or write an anonymous memo on Medium or something like that. But it's getting to a point where companies have no other choice right now to address some of these issues. So one thing that I recommend for organizations, and that I hear often, is people are like, I don't know how to call out racism. How do I address microaggressions? If I'm a white employee and I witness a manager saying we have to follow Black employees, or telling me that the Black employee is getting paid less, how do I address that? So one way is like bystander training, because part of the problem is that Black people aren't staying in companies when we realize that there's nothing being done for the racial microaggressions, whether we're reporting them to our managers or to HR. It's like we report them and nothing gets done. So bystander training, because non-Black people need to understand how to intervene when they witness racism taking place. So part of the problem is that people are hesitant. People don't know what to say. People don't know how to intervene. They don't want to disrupt their own job by speaking up and impacting their own job. But what a lot of people should realize and understand is that retaliation under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is illegal. So if I find out that my manager, as a Black woman, I'm getting paid less than my white female counterparts, and I go and I report my company to HR or to some other, to the EEOC, just by reporting them, if I get fired or I get demoted, all of that is retaliation, and that's illegal. So companies cannot do that. So like it's employees, we as employees have to understand our rights, but also equipping employees in organizations with the tools to like intervene, and managers with the tools to intervene when racism happens. Because I think part of the problem is that people don't even know how to, like, when they witness or overhear something, it's like, my manager said something racist. Do I laugh? Do I tell him that was wrong? What do I do if someone makes a comment about my hair on the Zoom call and nobody defends me? How do I address that? So a lot of it is like equipping employees with the tools to understand how to intervene when they witness racism taking place. I see Dennis said, it went up. Nathaniel said, if anyone has any sites to add to the chat on employee rights, can you please share? Nanthel, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, but I would definitely recommend looking at the EEOC website. If you just go to, or if you Google EEOC, you'll see a lot of information about your rights as an employee, and what retaliation encompasses. So it's not just getting paid less or getting demoted, but there's a lot of different things that it encompasses, excuse me. So as an employee, it's really important to understand your rights. So if you just look up Title VII Civil Rights Act, you'll see more about that through the EEOC, and there's other websites that have information about that. But if you want to report or your organization, if there's some sort of microaggressions or discrimination taking place, those are good resources that you can look at. Thank you, Patricia, for sharing that. So going back to that report from the Center for Talent and Innovation, another reason that they found in their report that Black people are leaving organizations is that a lot of us don't have opportunities for leadership. We are not given the tools to succeed. We're not given the tools to ascend in the workplace. So I always recommend to companies to make sure that you have some sort of mentorship program or sponsorship program in place, because if you take a Black employee or you take a Black job candidate and then dump them in an all-white environment without giving them any tools to succeed, you're not solving the problem. And I think that oftentimes that's what happens. There's so much money and focus put on trying to build a diverse pipeline, bringing Black people into the organization. But once Black people are in the organization, it's like, all right, y'all got it, fend for yourselves. We put you here, but you're not giving people the tools to be successful. So what opportunities are employees given to connect with leadership and to get promoted? What is the process to even get promoted? So all of these things are barriers to Black ascension in the workplace. And if you feel like I'm going to be working here in the same position for 5, 10, 20 years, I'm not staying at a company where I feel like I don't have opportunities for growth and I don't have opportunities for progression. So thinking about like what pathways are in place so that our Black employees can ascend and can rise is one way to resolve that issue. And there's a lot of research that indicates that having a mentorship program in place, having a sponsorship program, particularly for Black females and women of color, Black Indigenous women of color, mentorship and sponsorship programs are so instrumental to career growth. So is there an internship program in place? Because in the tech industry in particular, they always claim that there's a pipeline issue. We can't find qualified Black people. We can't find this. We can't find that. There's not a pipeline issue. It's where they're looking. So is there any sort of internship programs in place so that you can at least have or build that pipeline of diverse employees coming into the organization? Patricia said, it is very important. I need that type of mentorship and I didn't have it. Yeah, a lot of us as Black employees are left to sort of fend for ourselves and find our own mentors. But when companies are asking themselves, which a lot of companies, like everything that's been happening is like putting a mirror to these companies, and they're like, oh my gosh, why do Black people feel this way in our company? It's definitely like we need to have mentorship programs. And even when you have a mentorship program, what is the purpose of it? Because I was in an organization years ago where I participated in a mentorship program. It was like a women's mentorship program. I was a junior employee and I was paired with a senior employee. And there was no goals. It was kind of like, hey, y'all figure it out. Y'all go for coffee whenever you want. But we ended up like the relationship ended up sort of fizzling out because we didn't know what the ultimate purpose of the relationship was. And it shouldn't be left up to the mentor and the mentee to define the terms of the relationship. It should be the company crafting what that mentor-mentee relationship should look like. I see, Nikisha, you said the companies are looking at Ivy League schools with very little Black STEM students. They rarely go to HBCUs and non-Ivy Leagues. Exactly. And when we're talking specifically about tech, a lot of them go to the schools in that area. They go to UCLA. They go to, what is that school called? And I'm forgetting the name, but they go to Stanford. So they go to a lot of the schools that are in that area. And then they go to, even if you're looking at Stanford, there are multicultural groups in Stanford. Why don't you look at the multicultural groups or if they have like NSBE at Stanford? Why don't you go and look there? But, or look at, like Dennis said, blacksintechnology.net. Go to the website and look. The resources, there's so many resources out there. And there's a lot of HBCUs that excel in the STEM fields. When you're talking about engineering and science, there's so many. So it's like, how many HBCUs are there in the US? And you're telling me that you can't find qualified Black engineers? It's not adding up. So there's so many colleges and universities that they could be looking at. But if companies are serious about making a commitment to retaining Black employees, there has to be some sort of like pathways to build and to connect with leaders. Otherwise, it's just going to be like, I'm not staying in a company where I'm not going to ascend in the organization and I'm not being given the tools to succeed. So that's really important. And then we talked about diversity reports, but one thing that I want to see that I haven't seen, and if I'm wrong, anyone feel free to correct me, is that so when I look at Google's diversity report, for example, Google's like, the number one tech, creme de la creme, all of that. Google will tell me, okay, this is the number of intersectional women we hired. So they show you Latinx, they show you Black, they show you Native American, and I believe Pacific Islander. And so they show you all those numbers. And then they say, this is how many are in senior leadership positions. Yay, let's say there's a 1% increase in the number of underrepresented women that were in senior leadership roles. Yay! But what they don't tell us is how many of those women stayed in the organization. These companies have been keeping diversity reports for the last 6 years, since 2015, 2014. So you have 6-7 years worth of diversity reports. You're not able to tell me if that Black manager that was in the company in 2014 stayed at the company, because I think that their diversity reports are only showing us like one side of the picture. If we see that, like, and what they're touting is like, we've grown with diversity. We went from 3% Blacks in our organization to 4%. Yay! But like, are they new employees? Which in a lot of cases, that's what it is. You just hired a bunch of employees, but they're not staying. So it's not really giving us a full picture. It's just showing us this is our current representation. But what I want these tech companies to start to show us, and I think when we're thinking about how to resolve this issue, it's going back to, like, we have to look at how many of these senior leaders are staying at the company. So that's important. Looking at how many are leaving the company. Are we assessing racial equity in leadership positions and then over time? Because a lot of these factors in the diversity reports, and I always check them every year to see, but they don't show us that, and they don't show us the attrition rates. They just show us current representation, but that doesn't give us like the full and entire picture. So that's kind of like, I guess, and I'm trying to stay within the time frame, but that's kind of like a very condensed version of the reasons why a lot of tech companies are unable to retain their Black employees. And I think that our inability to have these discussions like we're having now, and our inability to, we're not even adequately assessing the data. We're not looking at how many people are actually staying. We're not looking at our attrition rates. A lot of tech companies, with all of the data that they have, are not looking at exit interview information. When I leave a company, most people give an honest evaluation of the organization when they leave. And those can give you clues on why you're not able to retain employees, why your culture is not inclusive, all of these factors that are not being examined by organizations. So I think that now is the time for companies to really put a focus on, tech companies to put a focus on all of these things. So I see Nikisha says what levels they are hiring, mainly lower level. Yeah, not see exactly. So they're telling us, and the diversity reports do tell us now, within the last few years, they started telling us how many people are of different, what is the racial breakdown, in leadership. So they do tell us, but I don't know, actually, they tell us women in senior leadership. I believe they tell us the racial breakdown, but they do not tell us how many of those people were there last year or the year before or the year before, because we're not solving the retention problem. These diversity reports tout their numbers, but they're not telling us, like, they're showing us, hey, we're able to attract, of course Google is going to be able to attract Black people, but are they staying? Are you creating an environment where they feel like they can thrive and they can grow? So that's like to be determined, because the diversity reports don't really show us that. Lisa said the tech companies also hire Black employees under the premise of doing one job and then giving them lesser assignments or roles once they join. Yeah, so it's like you're hiring them for one role, then they get there and they're overwhelmed with maybe what it is that you're asking them to do, or you're giving them, like you said, Lisa, lesser projects, so they're not able to maybe grow and excel in the company. So it's like that plays into a lot of the more systemic issues within the company, but all of these issues aren't really being addressed. And I see Kirsten said, what are your thoughts on employees sharing their salary as a means of protection against companies paying Black employees? Kirsten, I'm a huge fan of transparent salaries. I advocate for it. And I think that there's a company, y'all may have heard of it before, but if you just look up Buffer, Buffer, Buffer Transparent Salaries. Buffer is a company that everyone's salary in the company is on the website, and you can download it as an Excel spreadsheet, and they show you where people live, what their salary range is, what their name is. So all of that information. And I think what that does is if I see that I'm working the same, if I see Kirsten, you and I work in the same role, live in the same city, but you're getting paid $20,000 more than me for the same role, and that will help me to realize, hey, there's some sort of pay inequities. So I'm a huge advocate of pay transparency for all companies, and a lot of public universities do that, where if you're a public university, everyone's pay grades are online. So that's not something that's like private. So I'm a huge fan of it. Mike said, no, it is taboo to talk about, it's taboo to talk about your salary here in the UK. Yeah, and I think, Mike, that honestly, that's part of the problem, is that we're not talking about salary, and particularly it's super duper taboo amongst women. Women are less likely to talk about salary and how much they make than men. And that's part of the problem, is if I don't know that I'm getting underpaid, if I'm getting underpaid, I don't know that because I'm not even having conversations with people in my industry. So I advocate us talking more about salary and things like that, because that's how you figure out if you're getting paid what you're worth. Nanthali said, it's been told to do this because so many companies discriminate through pay. Yeah, John said, are there clear measures for success associated with most of these diversity reports? So John, I don't know if I understand your question. Do you mean, are these, yeah, could you rephrase? I don't know if I quite understand that question. Lily said, any advice for startups to attract Black talent? By the way, the company I'm thinking of has a tiered pay system. Yeah, I would think about where you're looking. I always recommend historically Black colleges and universities if you're looking for Black engineers. Also NSBE, the National Society of Black Engineers. This organization, there's a lot of resources out there and online. And if you have to look, because some companies can't afford relocation costs, because I would say, look at HBCUs, but if there are no HBCUs in the area where your startup is located, I would definitely recommend looking in the multicultural organizations at different colleges. If there are partnering with Black fraternities and sororities, and seeing if there's anyone in that network, because you could reach out to a Black fraternity or sorority, and they have a vast network of different professionals, and they can post something on their website saying, hey, we're looking for engineers, we're looking for, I guess it depends on if you're able to pay for relocation costs. But that's what I would do. And then if there's a way to, one thing I always advocate for any organization is having a blind resume system, because I think that that's something that's simple, where unconscious bias can seep in, is if you are able to see a person's name and Google them, which if you're on a hiring committee, you shouldn't be able to see any indications of the person's name, their race, their age. So blocking out the years someone graduated or went to school, blocking out any gender identifiers on the resume. So all of that, I would try to make sure that the hiring process and selection process is as objective as possible. And then I also don't advocate for like referral programs and systems, because those usually just create a system of more white men working in an organization. If John can recommend Brad, who can recommend Joe, who can so I definitely wouldn't advocate for like a referral program. Nikisha said, Patricia, what are your thoughts on companies that host these diversity events? And often there are Black or Latinx, white, blah, 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 touting how great the company is and what they did, but the incoming numbers, do not reflect that. Are they begging for diversity applicants to apply? That's a good question, Nikisha. I've been part of a panel at a large tech company. I wasn't affiliated with the organization, but we were talking. It was the Latinx and the Black Employee Resource Group got together and hosted this event, and they were inviting Black people to come and talk about inclusion. So that one was a little different, but yeah, I think that like that's another example of like asking Black employees to come talk about the diversity. They probably felt obligated to do it, So is it really like reality? And then if you hear them talking and then you look at their organization and you see that there isn't a lot of representation, are their words aligning with their actions? And I have to also say that just because a company doesn't have a lot of diverse employees doesn't mean that they're exclusive, because I've worked in organizations where I was the only Black woman, but my employees did not make me feel like I was not part of the team. So I want to make sure that I point that out, that a lot of times it's an indication that it's not an inclusive environment, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you might be one of the few, but the organization does many things to make you feel valued and included. I see Mike said being Black in tech can also be a lonely experience. Sadly, here in UK, you are often the only one. So if many of us are leaving, does this create a vicious cycle? Yeah, that's a good question. And you have to kind of go where we go where other people like us are. So I mean, it's tough. Or you could go and work for Black people who have their own tech companies. There's some on this call right now, or on this webinar right now, but you could go to, I think that's what a lot of people are doing, or they're starting their own tech companies because they don't want to be or feel like they're the only in their organization anymore. So Kirsten said, any advice on bringing up the fact that a company's chief execs and board of directors looks like someone copied and pasted the stock image of a generic white businessman? So Kirsten, is there actually, is there racial diversity in the organization, or did they actually take a stock photo? And because that's what a lot of companies do. I'm sure y'all have seen this before. Companies will get on their website because they know people will get up there on their website. And if they don't have their team members, they might go and take some stock images. Universities do this a lot too, where they'll take the only Black person and say, come here, we're going to get you to take a picture for the website, post them up. Like, we're so diverse. We value diversity and all of this stuff. So I guess I would ask Kirsten if the company is actually diverse or if they're just using the stock images to make themselves look diverse. I think that's another reason people will leave. If you kind of lied or you put up this image as if you were diverse and then you were not. When I got there, if the environment is very exclusive, then I wouldn't. That's another reason why I feel like Black people wouldn't be staying at the organization. Oh, Karsten. I'm sorry, Karsten. But yeah, it was a joke on how I said it. But I'm asking, how do I address that every leader is a white man, no Black people, and little. If there's any time to address it, Karsten, I think now is the time, because everybody's having a national conversation on equity and inclusion. So I think that bringing it up and just saying, I noticed that there's not a lot of, and I'm assuming you're talking about the organization that you work for. If you work there, it's easier to have the conversation than if you are like an outsider. But I'm assuming if you work there, I think sending out an email to leadership and asking and saying, I've noticed that, now that racial equities in the national conversation, what commitment are you as company XYZ doing to ensure that people of different races are being treated equitably? And also, like, how are you ensuring that there is different representation in leadership? So all of these questions are important to ask. I feel like I saw a template online where someone had statements that you could be asking your employer, or statements you could be asking your university, but I would use those with a grain of salt, because you may be risking your job when you ask these questions and you bring these things up. So that's also an important consideration to make.
We are just at time.
I'm sorry.
Wanted to make a point. We are at time. We'll probably do a couple more questions, but I want to respect people's time if there are other commitments they have. So it's your discretion. So proceed, please.
I see William said, it is interesting that some of these issues are faced in education. I've been teaching for 32 years, taught with NASA, taught in higher education, and I'm still questioned about my credentials. Wow. but I'm proud of the fact that what I've accomplished and share my journey with. Yeah, that's amazing, William. I mean, I commend you for 32 years of teaching, and you've taught with NASA. But as a Black person, you could have a Nobel Peace Prize, have taught at NASA, have graduated from Harvard, have 8 degrees, and people will still question your worth and your validity and your all of these things.
Be president of the United States.
Exactly. You could be president of the United States, have graduated, top of your class, Harvard, all of this stuff, and people will still be like, are you a citizen? You're not really, you didn't. So it's like going to be ongoing. But I'm glad that you're able to, William, inspire youth and teens and young adults, and they can see themselves in you, and they can see that because you've made it, they can too. Mike said, I've heard the rhetoric that there are so few Black people in tech roles because we just aren't interested in tech. How do we change that narrative? That's a great question, Mike. I think part of it is us or people who are in tech going and doing what William said and like speaking with young people. And a lot of it is young people don't necessarily see tech possibly as a route and as a path. And there's actually, and I wish I remembered the name of the website, but I follow and I'm connected with someone on social media, and he does these free boot camps to teach people how to code. And it's enrolling your kids and things like that. And it's for kids, for adults, for people of all ages, but it's showing people that there's a world beyond maybe the possibilities that you thought of, like, okay, I have to do this because my parents did this. But it's like a lot of Black people didn't know that like going into tech is an option and a possibility. So I think part of it is like people in the field taking their time to and dedicating their time and giving up their time to really speak with young people and show them the different pathways. You might not take a traditional pathway. You might not have gone to school for tech, but you might enroll in a coding boot camp. So there is like multiple options, and helping people to understand the options is also really important.
Yeah, and I'll just add really briefly that is part of the work that our organization does, is educate the community. We do speak at schools. We have mentorship programs for young adults and teens. So we'll get the word out there. And also for Mike, we are very close to opening up a UK chapter. So if you feel like you're alone now, you won't be for long. But definitely check back and keep in touch with us.
Yes, and thank you for the anonymous attendee. That was, I just looked in the Q&A, and it was Oracle. That was the organization where they underpaid by millions of dollars Asian and Black. I don't remember if it was Asian and Black people or Asian and Black women. But yes, it was Oracle. I just saw that, and I'm glad, because that was bothering me. So Dennis, did you want us to go through one more question?
Yes, one last question.
Okay, I saw a question okay, Nikisha, I saw your question and I thought it was a great question. Do you feel that white adjacency attitudes occur with higher level Black executives? Definitely. I think that sometimes there's a crabs in a barrel mentality where you feel like you can be the only Black person in an organization who's of a high level. And there's this warped perception that having another Black person in a senior level would jeopardize your role within the organization. And it's unfortunate. I think that I don't want to say it's rare, but I think what happens more often is that Black people, when I have the opportunity to help another Black person out, I take that opportunity. But I know that there's some people who don't think like that. But I definitely think that Black people are also instrumental in perpetuating anti-Black views, colorist views, but that's a whole nother discussion. Pinterest has been called out for their diversity reports, right? Was it for their diversity report? I think I heard something about Pinterest, but I know we're gonna roll out. But it was so nice to chat with you all, and thank you all for joining. And Dennis, thank you so much for organizing this. And, I hope that y'all enjoyed the discussion and the conversation. I had a fun time.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. That was a fast hour. And,
Yeah.
even though we didn't get to have anybody else on the mic, Mike was going to try, Mike B was going to try, but it was a very spirited chat. I appreciate everybody who participated. Just another reminder, if you are not a member, you can get more information about events like this on Blacks in Technology's website, bitnyc.org is the local chapter, or blacksintechnology.net, the national chapter. Find out about what we're doing, join our community. Right now, there's a lot of free events because it's COVID season and everybody's shut in. So good time to catch up. And Janice, I want to thank you again for participating. This was awesome. And check out the book, Dirty Diversity. It is in bookstores now. It came out last week, right?
Yes, it came out actually on Juneteenth.
Oh, okay.
It was a little, yeah, the paperback was a little slow to get into the store, but yeah, it came out, and I was trying to find the link to put it in the.
Oh, okay. Hold on. Let's find the link. And actually, you know what I'll do? I'll send the link in the follow-up email that'll include the survey
Okay.
and the information about the follow-up. So,
Okay.
guys, check out the book. I'm looking forward to it. Is there an audiobook? Because I'm doing audiobooks now.
Yeah, there is. I narrated the
You
audiobooks too.
narrated. I'm definitely getting it
I
now.
love audiobooks too. I'm like obsessed with audiobooks. So I love physical books. I'm not an ebook person, but I did the ebook, the paperback, and the audiobook.
All right. Nice. Nice. Yes, definitely check it out. And thanks everyone again. Have a good evening. Bye.
Bye, everyone.